Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Awakening Report. I'm your host, Doug Hamp. Great to be with you. Hey, if you want to help support this ministry, you can go to my Patreon page and you can give there. I want to say thank you very much to everyone who is giving. It really does help. And thank you. Thank you so much for helping keep this on the air, or whatever we call it nowadays. Hey, I've got a special guest with me. I got Dr. Judd Burton, and he has been working on a book, and it's about monsters in folklore. It's really a biblical look at monsters. And you might say, monsters, what are we talking about? There's no such thing as monsters. Well, it all depends how you define a monster, right? A monster is anything that could be scary, out of the ordinary, something we don't see in our normal lives. But it turns out when you start looking in the literature, you start finding some very peculiar kind of creatures. And it's possible, I think, that some of them could have been dinosaurs some time ago. Some of them, maybe we just don't know. Maybe some of them could be spiritual. But I'm going to let him take us through it and you really get a better sense of what these monsters are all about. Hey, it's great to see you, Judd. How are you?
Hey, Doug, good to see you too. I'm doing great. How about yourself?
Good. Oh, doing well. Hey, and before we get any further, we have a conference coming up, the Sons of God conference. Can you tell us about that?
That's right. The Sons of God Giants of Old conference will convene on July the 17th and go through the 18th in Lubbock at the Fellowship Church. And as the number denotes, we are in our eighth incarnation of this conference, and we'll be talking about all things Watcher and Giant related, with the subfield of demonology, all of those being related. And we've got some great speakers this year. Yours truly, you're going to be there, and Dr. Mike Heiser, Doug Reed, Dr. Aaron Judkins, Joe Taylor, and the Gilberts recently informed me, Derek and Sharon, that they're not going to be able to make it, but they are going to video record their presentation, so we'll have the benefit of their most recent research as well.
Oh, very cool.
But it's going to be a great time, and tickets are $10, just the basic entry, and you can get those online or at the door, and then there's some VIP packages that people can take advantage of as well.
Very cool.
All at burtonbeyond.com. So yeah, it's going to be great.
BurtonBeyond.com is where they can get the tickets. Is that right?
That's right. That's exactly right. The link to the conference page is right on the homepage. So
okay, I'm going to write that in the chat so that people at burtonbeyond.com, so people can go ahead and go to that. It's going to be a wonderful conference. I'm looking forward to it. I'm excited. I'm doing some pretty cool research. At least I think it's cool. But sure. I want to hear about your research. I want to hear about these monsters. What's up with monsters and folklore, and how could they possibly be biblical? I think that's the big question.
Right. Of course, that word monster is pregnant with layers of meaning. We use that word. It's an emotive word. We usually associate it, with horror movies, whether they're good horror movies or cheesy horror movies. Folklore has always been good fodder, for those sorts of things, because it's always, it's typical. Those kinds of creatures have typically been rooted in the fear of mankind, and I would argue for good reason. Particularly when you begin to look at these things through the biblical lens, and you consider that they have demonic roots, that there are demonic spirits behind them. And so the challenge for people that subscribe to a Judeo-Christian worldview, for believers in particular, the challenge is stripping away the kind of literary facade that has grown up around these folkloric monsters. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing. The facade can be helpful in literature in sort of telling the story. And in certain cases, you get you get very creative and very good narratives, as in the case of Bram Stoker's famous novel about Dracula. And of course, the central creature there is a vampire. And I've heard it argued that Dracula may be the first Christian horror novel because there's so much faith-related weaponry that's used against the vampire in question, Count Dracula, um, during the course of the novel itself. And so I've been working on a book for a number of years, actually, that addresses these issues and ties the demonic roots of folkloric monsters back to at the very least the pre-flood world, and um, certainly to the demonic realm. Whatever sort of ideas that believers subscribe to in terms of the nature of demons and the origin of demons. I think one thing we can all agree on is that they serve an agenda, based on the ambitions of their leader, the devil, Satan, Lucifer.
Absolutely. And I think just to help people understand, again, a monster can really be anything that is scary, it's harmful, and perhaps it's perverted,
Sure.
not in a sexual sense, but it's not the creature that it ought to be, right? I mean, if you made a lion in the heart of Africa, that could be a monster, right? But typically we think of monsters as something that is beyond the normal, right? So, and the idea of a blood-sucking vampire, that is something that should not be, right? Regular people should not be sucking other people's blood, right?
Right.
That's the idea.
It's interesting that you bring up, the metaphor of the lion, even as because that sort of predation is in its nature, and so even within the scope of nature, that makes some kind of sense to us, right? There's some sort of logic to it. But in the case of some of these other creatures that are often chimerical, there's a sense that something is out of place, that they're preternatural, they're not natural. They're
right. Let's define chimerical, because that's a fancy term you got there. So let's go ahead and define that so that people are following what you mean by that. What is chimerical, or what's a chimera?
Well, chimerical is a $25 word. Well, I don't know if it's $25, but it's a fancy word for a combination, a creature that is a product of a combination of whether it's species or otherwise, that are not intended to produce offspring.
Right. It's coming from the Greek chimera, which was a lion.
That's right.
A snake, a goat.
Right.
And pretty much those three in different variations. Sometimes a bat, right? You could have different variations on this theme.
Certainly. Yeah. And so that's I mean, not all folklore creatures necessarily fit that pattern, but many of them do. That they belie the traits of different kinds of creatures that you might find in nature, and ones that don't conform to the the physics of our reality.
So what's interesting here is when we start talking about chimeras or chimera, this takes us back to the time of the flood, right? I mean, and if we read the some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, it talks about how they were corrupting all flesh, right? And there seems to have been, it's not specifically stated, but I believe we can infer from the text that something really perverted and weird and out of the ordinary was going on, and that there was some kind of a mingling of the different species. We see that in Scripture, of course, but in that Dead Sea Scrolls, that there was a corruption of all flesh.
That's right. It's not to use a pun, it's fleshed out in more detail in the apocryphal sources like Enoch. We get a good sense of birds and reptiles and beasts of the field. That their DNA being mixed in cases with humans and other animals, as a product of this sort of watcher experiment that comes to us from the antediluvian world, and that we read about in great detail in the apocryphal scriptures.
So can you give us an example of a creature that, without stealing your thunder for the conference, but is there maybe a creature or something in the literature that has come up, and you're like, okay, that's a monster. That is a motif that we find throughout some literature somewhere.
Yeah, let's start with one that that people would probably be most familiar with. The satyr, for example, from Greek mythology. Most people will be familiar with the Greek god Pan, the god of shepherds, who was a half man, half goat deity. He had typically is depicted beginning in the Archaic period as having the legs of a goat and the torso of a man, and maybe the horns and the long chin beard, goatee, of a he goat. And the interesting thing about the satyr is that conventionally scholars have traced Pan and the satyrs back to Arcadia, but we've learned in recent decades that their origins are probably ancient Near Eastern, and there have been some really good books that have set the pace for this, such as the Eastern Face of the Helicon, and just a parade of papers, academic papers, that illustrate something that scholars call Orientalizing, this influence of the ancient Near East through trade on the world of the Aegean. And so I have been convinced, as a number of scholars have been, that these creatures and many other like them, because the Greeks were the first to admit that many of their gods came from the East. That's what they believed. And I think Pan and the satyrs are no example. And so that would be a very probably one of the more familiar chimera that I believe came from the antediluvian world. And believe it or not, the Hebrews had a word. The ancient Hebrews had a word for this theme. They called them the Shedim. And you find them in, although the translations typically don't render them as such, most English translations don't. And you know this, being an Old Testament scholar yourself, the passage in Isaiah chapter 34 gives us a picture of what these things, these are the sort of ancient pagan goat gods like Uds and Adzaga, from that region, particularly the ancient Amorite kingdom, which Bashan and the Mount Hermon region was part of. Those are the kinds of creatures, the monsters, if you will, that passage is referring to.
What did you say is the Hebrew word? Asherim? Or
Shedim?
Shedim. Okay. Shedim. Okay. Got it.
I think the transliteration is usually Seirim.
Oh, Sedim or whatever. Sedim. I guess depends.
Yeah, not shedding, but Sarah. I'm sorry, it may not have come through. That may
be
my West Texas accent too.
I wasn't trying to test your accent. I was just trying to clarify. Well, that's interesting. That's the exciting thing about the Bible, is that, when you really start to look deeper, it's not that you can't see these things. It's just when you sometimes read it in English, or you're reading not really for details, you're just kind of reading for the big picture. You don't see that, right? I mean, it's like flying in a plane at 35,000 feet. You're seeing everything, but you're really not seeing everything. You're seeing the entire landscape, but you're not seeing the details. You're not seeing what's down there on the ground.
Yeah, and this stuff is literally hiding in plain sight.
Right.
That's why it's important to study the Bible. And you don't have to be a linguist to do that, because there's so many tools that people can take advantage of now to really dig into the scriptures and get a hand. I mean, language training is going to help you. I mean, that's the key to understanding the idioms and the mindset and the culture. But you don't have to be a linguist to discern this sort of stuff from scripture.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Once you do, you start finding all this weird stuff, and I was listening to a guy give a lecture on the Book of Giants,
Okay.
and he said, I want to say he's from maybe Trinity Western in British Columbia,
Okay.
and I can't think of his name right off the top of my head, but he said, look, if it's weird and it's in the Bible, it's probably pretty important. And
That's a
once you
great
start
word.
digging into this stuff, you
Yeah.
figure out,
Yeah.
man, is this a Tolkien novel, or am I reading the Bible?
That's because reality is just more exciting than we have been led to believe, or should I
That's
say
right.
allowed to believe, right? Sometimes there's a sense that we have to sterilize the message of the Bible. We've got to make it, prim and proper and good for, Sunday school or whatever you want to call it, and we can't have anything that's kind of weird. But I think it's that weird stuff that a lot of people are like, wow, that's really interesting. Maybe not everyone has to do something with that stuff, but it's like,
Yeah.
okay, I mean, I don't know. It's in there. I'll accept that, but that's why you come to a conference like this, is because we're going
Right.
to dig deep into this stuff. I'm
Sure.
curious though, have you done any research on manticores? Because that is something that's very, I don't know if it's dear to my heart, but I find it a very interesting topic.
Well, only passingly. I mean,
Okay.
that's not something that I cover specifically in the book that I'm working on, or actually just finishing. The Van Helsing book's called The Van Helsing Way,
Okay.
and it's an allusion, of course, to Professor Van Helsing from Dracula. But
Mhm.
no, I would love to do more on the Manticore, because it's a fascinating. Fascinating topic, but it's not. I'll just say that it's not one of the chapter headings in my book.
Okay, fair enough. I'll just give a quick little commercial break here. Is as I started looking at the creatures in Revelation chapter 9, I became convinced that the description given therein is really the same description as a manticore, and I kind of
Mhm.
stumbled upon this discovery. I kept looking. I'm like, okay, what could this monster thing be, right? And then I discovered the manticore, and I'm like, whoa, this is crazy, right? But
Uh-huh.
as I continued the research, then I discovered that so a manticore, just so people know, it's essentially a lion. It's got a lion's head, but with a man's face,
Mhm.
3 rows of teeth, scorpion or serpent's tail,
Mhm.
bat wings, right? I'm like, that is like a 95% ringer with what we
Yeah.
have in Revelation chapter 9. It just blew me away. So then, as I continued studying this, then I was teaching through the book of Revelation, and I came to where it talks about the beast that was, is not, and will rise again. And I'll just cut to the chase. I mean, I discovered that this is Nimrod, but Nimrod, his ancient name, he was actually deified as Ninurta. So
Mhm.
Ninurta is an Assyrian god,
Yep.
and Ninurta's symbol was the manticore.
Mhm.
So I'm like, oh, this is amazing.
Oh,
So
that's
yeah,
fascinating.
yeah. So I'm going to be talking about that at the conference. I mean, I think it's incredibly fascinating when you start just tying this stuff together. Oh, and get this. What is the woman Ishtar? What she's riding in the back of a what? Of a beast, right?
Mhm.
And what is that beast? It's a manticore, or it's Ninurta, right?
Yeah.
So it's just mind bending when you start connecting the dots. You're like, wow, this is so amazing.
Well,
So,
we're all pulling threads from the same tapestry here in
mhm,
many ways.
yeah.
Uh, that's another reason folks should come to this conference, because this is the kind of cutting edge stuff that you're going to get. Uh,
July
and I know.
17th and 18th in Lubbock, Texas, right?
Yep.
I put your link right here in the chat so people can go ahead and take a look at that. Burton Beyond, hope I spelled that right.
Yeah.
Um, and that's where they can go and get tickets. So if you guys want to join us, $10. I mean, that is a deal for a conference for 2 days.
Yeah.
I mean, that is a steal, really.
You know,
So it'd be great.
I have sort of half jokingly referred to you guys as my Avengers initiative, if there are Marvel fans out there, because I have the utmost respect for all of you guys' special talents and abilities and training. I think you're uniquely suited to address and deal with some of the issues that are very pertinent and yet still to a great degree are peripheralized today.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's well said. So tell me more about the book. Tell me more about where we're going to find these monsters in the literature and how, as biblicists, we can kind of interpret them through that biblical lens.
Right. Well, the book is laid out basically with chapter headings of these different creatures, and I sampled the ones that most people would probably be familiar with. Some of them are a little maybe a little obscure, but most of them, like vampires and werewolves, you know, a lot of people will be familiar with. There are other creatures like the zombie um, that I deal with as well, and even you know, the fallen angels and demons, you know, sort of qualify to a great degree if we're making a kind of taxonomy, a biblical taxonomy of the modern world. They fit nicely into that scope. And Dr. Mike Heiser and I have been talking about these issues on his show Fringe Pop 321. People can go to that YouTube channel and view some of the discussions that he and I have had on this very topic of looking at monsters, you know, first through the lens of the Bible and also through the lens of anthropology, and sort of marrying both of those approaches to see what we can glean from the source material. And I think that's an important approach, because so much of the legwork, the field work, has been done by anthropologists and folklorists and mythologists, sort of collating this stuff over the years. And why is it's important to look at it as students of the Bible and Christians, but because it's part of our supernatural worldview, whether we want to admit it or not. And sort of going back to the most familiar, that you know, kinds of monsters, the vampire. You know, I talk to people again and again who may be fans of the literature, and they can't. Some of them even Christians, and they can't seem to strip away the cinematic or the TV vampire or the literary vampire from the fact that this is a demonic spirit that wants to use you and drain you, you know, not necessarily blood, but certainly life force. In many cases, particularly if you consider, you know, the ritualism that's involved in Luciferianism or Satanism, you know, a lot of those things are blood rituals, and so there's a vampiric element to it. And some people are just so adamant about holding on to, well, vampires can't possibly exist. You know, in their minds, they're thinking about these, you know, reanimated corpses, you know, drain people of blood and dress up like European noblemen. Well, that's really not the case, particularly if you look at the demonic roots of them. You made allusion to the antediluvian world, and in most cases, I tie these monsters back to what's going on in the pre-flood world. In fact, if you look at some of the interesting judgments that God hands down to the Watchers and their progeny, the Nephilim, you know, it's not a their fate is not a pleasure cruise. You know, the Watchers are thrown into the Greek equivalent of Tartarus, and the spirits of the Nephilim, you know, however people subscribe to or want to, you know, put them in the taxonomy of demons, are condemned to oppress men and ruled the world, or roam the world rather. And I'm paraphrasing here, but Enoch chapter 15, people can look it up, says there'll be unclean spirits on the earth, and something like they're always hungry and thirsty but never sated. The first scholar to actually make this connection between the pre-flood world and the vampire that I know of was Montague Summers. And Montague Summers was kind of an interesting antiquarian. He was a priest, a clergyman, and a classicist. And he wrote a couple of books on vampires. One, The Vampire is Kith and Kin, and the other one was The Vampire in Europe. And both of these works, particularly the former, I would highly recommend, even just on the basis of the bibliography, because it is comprehensive. Summers was a polyglot. He spoke several modern languages, romance languages, and also was conversant in ancient Greek and Latin and Hebrew. And I think he even dabbled a little bit in what was known at the time of cuneiform script. So, and Egyptian hieroglyphs too, I think. So he was just an incredible Renaissance man of a scholar, and he makes this connection between what's going on in the pre-flood world and the vampire. And so I'm just, in many ways, I'm expanding upon that and trying to bring it to a modern audience.
That's fascinating. Yeah, you know, the whole thing about blood, I think, is incredibly fascinating.
Right.
I mean, why blood, right? Why would drinking somebody's blood do anybody any good, right? And I think if we start asking the question, okay, why? What is the purpose? How could this help? What's in it for Satan and his henchmen to do this? You know, I always feel that that's a very important question. And the answer that I've come up with is that just when Adam and Eve fell, they were disconnected from God's, you know, from the power, if you will, right? He's the power source. They were disconnected. So now we eat things from the earth, right? Because Adam comes from the Adamah, right? So we have something to kind of recharge those batteries until batteries don't work anymore, right? So Satan and his dudes were disconnected as well. You see that pretty clearly in Ezekiel chapter 28. So if Satan is a spiritual being, not a terrestrial being, but he's of a spiritual nature, what is he going to use to recharge his batteries?
Yeah.
I would suggest blood. I mean, I really think it's the Matrix, right? I mean, Neo Anderson wakes, you know, discovers that he's just a battery. That's all he is.
Yeah.
Right. I think that is exactly what Satan has been doing, is that we're the batteries and he needs to keep sucking on us. And the blood, even though he may not drink a vial of it, but the letting of that blood, and the more innocent the victim, the more energy that he can put in his own battery. But of course, he's never satiated, right? Because his batteries keep wearing out because he's not connected to the source.
That's right. That's well said. All of that is very well said. And, you know, we're reminded, you know, on the one hand, not only is the sacrality of blood a near cultural universal on the planet, you know, regardless of the tradition we're talking about, but in Scripture, you know, we get a very crystal picture of what the importance of blood is. You know, so much so that there are prohibitions about its consumption in the Levitical laws. You know, most people will be familiar with the you know, the passage in Leviticus that says, you know, don't drink the blood, because the blood, you know, the life is in the blood. And so there's a kind of supernatural component, you know, to it, that even if we can't quantify that this side of heaven, you know, that idea is made clear in a number of places in the Old Testament. And in many ways, the vampire is a terrible sort of parody of what Christ offers. You know, you know, and this is Satan's MO too, is to turn everything, make it counterfeit,
Mhm.
If you look at the word antichristos, it's a false Christ. It's a counterfeit Christ. And so
Mm.
in the same character makeup, vampires are a parody of what Christ offers. Christ offers eternal life.
Mhm.
All of this tied back to his blood.
Right.
The eternity that Satan offers, and by proxy, these vampiric demonic spirits,
Mhm.
is
Yeah, you
false.
can also be eternal if you just become a vampire, right? That's the, there's always a carrot. I think we always have to say, what is the carrot? What's the dangling thing that is getting, man to just keep coming across and
Right.
following his own destruction? But there's some greed that man is operating on,
Hmm.
some banal greed that we're willing to, sell our souls for,
Hmm.
if only we can have this particular pleasure or this counterfeit, thinking
Sure.
it may be the real thing, but of course we know it's not. And yeah, that's the big deception, right? I mean, he's pretty good at that too, unfortunately.
Well,
Yeah,
he has, millennia on us.
yeah, yeah. There's a couple of questions I want to get to these if we could.
Sure.
This is from Brilliant Radiance. Is Dr. Burton familiar with the creatures in the Clifot and if they're in the Bible?
Uh, which creatures?
They're Clifot. I have never heard of
I
Clifot.
am not.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
probably should be, but I am not. You just
Okay.
gave me homework.
Okay. Spelled Qliphoth. So yeah, I've not heard of those. So good. You stumped him. That's good.
Yep, it happens. It happens.
That's right. Okay, next question. This is from Sally. Do you think today's representations of zombies on TV, etc., is accurate?
That's an interesting question. It sort of depends on what your definition of a zombie is. But the interesting thing about, whereas, and whether we're talking about revenants or for instance, the ghoul from Arabian folklore, or like the Haitian zombie, which is a kind of, reanimate. Um, the modern sort of TV or cinematic zombie that you find in shows like The Walking Dead, um, are almost entirely bereft of any sort of supernatural connection. They're postmodern zombies. The zombies that are created on these shows are the result of a pathogen, a pandemic, uh, which is sort of interesting commentary for what's going on right now.
Yeah.
Um, but in that respect, no, I don't think they are accurate. I mean, it's a it's a kind of cinematic or literary departure from the source material, the anthropological material that I think George Romero made. Um, George Romero and Richard Matheson was a guy that wrote a book called I Am Legend, which was also made into a movie. And it was originally a vampire story, but the vampirism was caused by also caused by a pathogen. It wasn't caused by a demonic spirit. So these are examples of the trajectory of postmodern literature and cinema. But as far as a Bible believing Christian, yeah, it's not an accurate depiction.
So what you're saying is the biblical variation on that theme would be the source of it would be from demons, right? Whereas
Right,
what we're seeing on TV is because some virus or something
right.
has interfered with humanity, and now we've
It's a
lost our
yeah,
minds.
complete secular materialist interpretation. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Right, because there is no spiritual world as they would have us believe, etc. Okay, interesting. This is a question from Jay Vela. What are your thoughts on the current situation with some type of forced injection with things that will change our DNA? Will we turn or become some sort of monster?
That those are distinct possibilities. I think I'm certainly not a virologist or a biological scientist, but you again, you don't really have to be get a grasp on what's going on. I think actually, Doug, you've done quite a bit of research on this,
Yeah.
and the if we want to call it that, the return of monsters is kind of happening right now, if we're to believe what's going on in laboratories, whether they're government contracted or private think tank laboratories. I to sort of bring this back home to me, I'm in Merkel, Texas right now, my hometown, and I wrote a book a number of years called The Paranormal Big Country, and one of the local legends has to do with a goat man, which was basically a satyr kind of a figure. And you find these stories all over Texas. And one of the stories is that this thing was cooked up in a lab that was associated with the Department of Agriculture. Whereas once I might have been able to sort of laugh that off, I don't think you can really do that now with what's being done in the realm of genetics and what we're able to do technologically with that sort of biological or genetic engineering, because we've already made hybrids and chimeras, under the auspices of product development and probably weaponization too. So yeah, those injections, it's not a great leap or feat of imagination to think that's possible.
Yeah, I'm totally with you. I'm actually writing a new book. It's gonna be a series of books, actually. I'm going to talk about creating the beast. So I'm going all the way back to the beginning. You got to start at the beginning to understand the story. And so in book 1, I'll be talking about Satan's, his history, what he was up to.
Right.
Then I'll talk about Nimrod and Ninurta, etc. Book 2, I'll talk about a lot of the current state of affairs, what's happening technologically. And then book 3, I'll talk about when people have taken the mark. And we actually see in Revelation chapter 16, it talks about these people that have, they're obviously the bad guys, right? So we know from previous chapters that they have taken the mark of the beast, and they're going to have these terrible sores come upon them. And I did a teaching at the congregation some months ago. It was kind of nasty because I had to talk about some yucky skin diseases and stuff. But I think basically my take on it is that people will become zombies, for lack of a better word. I think people will basically become zombies. And I think part of it, what's going to happen, like it's interesting in Revelation chapter 9, it says that that people will seek death and it will flee from them. That sounds like a zombie to me, right? If you can't kill yourself, what are you, right? If you want to die, but you can't die, then it sounds like you're the living dead.
Yeah.
And so, my take is that they will actually become zombies. And thankfully, God has some safety measures, so this can't happen easily. But if you continue to break the safety measures and to not listen to the warnings, then yes, you can put yourself in that terrible jeopardy, and there will be no peace for people to go into that direction.
I think that's not only possible, I think it's probable. I think we're on a trajectory for it. And that brings us back to the concept of counterfeit salvation, counterfeit eternity.
Yeah, exactly. And that's scary. Not good at all. Quite scary. Another question, kind of a comment. I just wanted to get your thoughts on this. This is from Tamara. Nephilim are fallen angels and Rephaim are giants. What's your thought on that? Is that accurate? Is that maybe?
No, I don't think so. I don't think the conflation of Nephilim and fallen angels is either culturally, historically accurate or linguistically accurate. And I have seen a number of researchers who have strength in other areas, particularly folklore. I've seen Andrew Collins, who I don't agree with, in terms of his worldview, but he does do some good work. But he's one of those that conflates the Watchers and the Nephilim, and again, historically, linguistically, it doesn't make any sense.
So you have the Watchers, or the B'nai Elohim, right?
Right.
That's the name of the conference, right? The Sons of
Right.
God. So how are they different from the Nephilim? What's the difference?
The Nephilim appear to be progeny, and again, you don't have to be a linguist to read the narratives and figure that out. Not only the Genesis 6 material, but the apocryphal stuff, particularly Enoch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And tomorrow, in my book, Corrupting the Image, you go to my website as well, douglashamp.com. I have a chart. You'll just have to search for it, but I have a correlation of the names so that you can see
Sure.
that the Nephilim were the same as the Anakim, which are the same as the Rephaim, the
Right.
Emim, the Zamzumim, the Amorim. They're all one and the same, or same progeny, if you will.
It's interesting that in the ancient Near Eastern mind, particularly the Levantine peoples like the Hebrews, and to an extent the Aramaeans, Nephilim became a kind of generic term for later giants, because the later generations, the post-flood generations like the Anakim and the Rephaim and the laundry list of them, it's not uncommon for them to be lumped in and compared to the Nephilim, like in the Numbers account with with the spies in the Holy Land.
Yeah.
And it's also interesting that there are similar cognates in other Semitic languages like Aramaic. I'm trying to think of the cognate. It's very similar to Nephal. It's got that the transliteration, the NF, NPH element to it. That literally means giants. So there's some there's some historical linguistic, social linguistic, sort of equations that you deal with here, and they give you a clearer picture of what's being talked about in the Hebrew material.
Very cool. Zayani is asking, are those creatures Sumerians or are they Near Easterns? Maybe you can distinguish that a little bit for people so they can understand there's, or if there's a difference between Sumerian and ancient Near Eastern.
The simplest answer is yes.
Okay.
They are ancient. They're Sumerian and ancient Near Eastern. Ancient Near Eastern is a general topic, a general description of the region of Mesopotamia, the Levant, Anatolia, Egypt, parts of the Arabian Peninsula. When people talk about the ancient Near East, that's what they're talking about. And of course, the Sumerians were one of the older civilizations in the ancient Near East. Yeah,
which the Sumerian just means between two rivers, Shneneot. So it's the word for Shinar, and the variation on that is Shinar, Sumer, Shumer. They're the same exact thing. So,
which is interesting. These are all those are all names that other people gave them. Shumer was an Akkadian word.
Right.
I think the word that the Sumerians actually called themselves was Kiangir, which meant the black-headed people, because their forebears were probably related to the earlier Ubaid civilization, both of whom were coming from kind of the region between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. That's so much. That's a footnote to what we're talking about here, but it's interesting that they bring up the Mesopotamian material, because the analog for the Watchers in the Hebrew material would be the Sumerian Apkallu, and then you have you have a similar kind of offspring in the form of the Anunnaki, who would sort of be the parallel, the pre-flood giants, the Nephilim.
I've often wondered if Anunnaki are actually fallen angels, or if they're actually the ones on the ground. And I got the sense they were the kind of the spirits, the gods.
Right.
I don't know. Maybe your research is taking
it's difficult. It's kind of difficult. It is a challenge to kind of muddle through that. But what's interesting about it is that they're clearly talking about the same cabal of pre-flood entities.
Right, right. Yeah. And what's interesting about this whole discussion is that if we take this discussion out of this context, out of this language setting, if we take it out of the nomenclature that we're using and put it into a different one, we could have a show called Ancient Aliens, right?
Right.
And once you put it in that context, that we're not talking about ancient spirit beings, but we're talking about ancient aliens, right? Ancient ETs, then suddenly many people in the world are like, well, tell me more about this, right? Because it starts with the worldview. If you think that there is no God and we just happen to, through evolution, pull up ourselves up by our bootstraps, and here we are, then the ancient alien theory makes a whole lot of sense. But we're talking about the same thing. We just happen to believe, based on our reading of the Bible and our belief in God, that he's created other beings, spirit type beings, that are just as real, just as active. They're harder to see, but they have left a footprint. And so we're kind of discussing that, right? And we start talking about these ancient monsters. These are clearly the bad guys. These are the people that are working, not people, but angels, fallen angels, whatever, that are working with Satan. And they don't have humanity's best interests at heart.
No.
They've done a lot of interesting stuff, and often bad stuff, obviously.
Yeah. And here again, this brings us back in the case of Ancient Aliens. It brings us back to the postmodern, strictly secular materialist interpretation of these events that transpired, in basically prehistory and early antique history.
Yeah. Another question, this is from Ron. He says, I've witnessed Bigfoot, curious about your take on them.
I have two theories about Bigfoot or Sasquatch, whatever appellation you want to put on him. I think that it's possible that it is a remnant of an earlier hominid. I don't know that I completely agree with the late Professor Grover Krantz, but he was a Washington State anthropologist that always thought that they were an offshoot or a remnant population of Gigantopithecus, which was a huge prehistoric ape. I suppose that's possible. My other theory, and consequently, this was one that grew later after hearing more accounts of Sasquatch not only appearing in the woods, but also sort of mysteriously disappearing under sort of paranormal circumstances, strange circumstances. So it may be that they're extra dimensional and demonic.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, it's kind of one of those big question marks, and we're not entirely sure what it is. So
I think either one is possible because if it's a hominid, then it's an intelligent creature, and we shouldn't be surprised that it hides from big populations.
right.
But the other is, for people who subscribe to a biblical worldview, the other is possible and should be considered seriously.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. I'm just looking for more questions here. So I think we're caught up. So that's cool. Wow. Well, this is fascinating stuff. So we only got a couple minutes left here. So again, tell us where people can go to find out more about the conference, what the basic theme is going to be, and when.
Well, people can find out about the conference. They can go to my site, Burton Beyond, and there'll be a link at the very top of the page to the conference page, where people can get information on speakers and tickets and directions and all that good stuff. And the general theme of the conference is pretty much self-contained in the title. It's the Sons of God, Giants of Old. The overarching theme being the most recent research on related topics. What the Watchers, the pre-flood, post-flood giants, and also demonology. and you won't be disappointed. We've had to make some alterations because of all the COVID stuff, but we're still having it. We're still going forward. And as an outgrowth of my Institute of Biblical Anthropology, this is a conference that's quickly gaining notoriety, not only in the region but in the country. And that was my intent, because this information is pertinent and people need to be familiar with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. How do we find a balance, though, Judd, between kind of studying some of this stuff and not freaking out, geeking out? And I've had people call me and say, "I think I'm a Nephilim. What do I do?" How do we find that balance so that we don't go to one extreme or the other?
Well, the old timers around here used to say, keep one eye on the eastern sky and one eye on your work. So you can't, if I can use another West Texas colloquialism, you can't be so heavenly minded that you're no earthly good, because that does neither you or the kingdom work that we as believers have to do. We have to be rooted in reality and the problems of our time, and taking care of our families and all of that stuff. We have to balance that out with the very often strange reality of our supernatural worldview.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's well said. I mean, we should never be fearful of these things. We should always keep our eyes on the Lord. But again, keeping one eye over here, and then understanding that Jesus is completely in control. He's got us. But
he's never taken his hands off the wheel, and perfect love drives out all fear.
Yep, that's right. Yeah. So I think this is one of the questions that came up last year. Somebody said, "Well, how are we supposed to tell people all this stuff?" I think I actually got that question, and my response was, "Don't tell them." Right? I mean, this is not the gospel of the Nephilim, right? That's not what we're supposed to be spreading. We're supposed to be spreading the good news about the kingdom of Jesus, right? Now, as part of this bigger book, this literature, this corpus of information that we have, these are important and exciting details that we really enjoy geeking out on, right? But we
certainly do. None of us plant a flag on the hill that this material is salvific. We're not talking about the Great Commission. We're not talking about salvation.
Right.
But what the topics that we're covering are still absolutely essential to understanding the biblical narrative. I think years ago, Steve Quayle said that it was a kind of Rosetta Stone for understanding the Bible.
Yeah,
there's some truth to that.
Yeah. Not entirely, but if you leave them out, if you leave out the Nephilim, etc., then you're like, wait, why did God, drown all those people in the flood? Well, if you understand that they were Nephilim, then you're like, oh, okay, I get it, right? Yeah.
And the comparison is even still accurate when you consider that when the Rosetta Stone was translated, it was still a truncated understanding of those ancient languages.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well said. Well, wow. Thank you, Judd, for coming on and for sharing with us. How can people find your new book? Where would they get that?
Well, you'll get notifications from Burton Beyond, and people can also look at the Institute website at tioba.org. I'm in the process of transferring my catalog over to Amazon, so people will be able to get it there, and my books too. And you can follow me on Twitter, YouTube, all that good stuff. I'm there.
Very cool. All right. Well, thank you again. It's really been a pleasure to have you, and I'm looking forward to seeing you July 17th and 18th.
Yes, sir. Thank you. It was my pleasure.
All right. Take care.